I'm an accessibility advocate and a senior front-end engineer at ESO here in Belfast. I will mention some stuff that we're doing in ESO as part of this talk. You can find me at claire.w on Twitter, or Claire Bones in like most other places, Slack and NI Tech Slack, things like that if you're looking at me, or you can just find me wandering about for the rest of today and tonight at the after party for sure. Yeah, so I work at a place called ESO, and our corporate mission is to make a difference by improving community health and safety through the power of data. So my job in there is a front-end developer, so what I'm doing is making the applications that all of our clients and customers use to be able to fulfill that mission. So we make a lot of software for emergency services, fire brigades, ambulances, hospitals, things like that. So it's pretty crucial that our software is easy to understand and easy to use, both sitting down in a hospital setting but also on the move. Some of our clients are like fire brigades out running about with a tablet with our software on it, and that's a big part of the importance of UX and the front end of our applications. So yeah, your users, as I said. Our end users are those emergency services people and people in the hospitals and things like that. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm talking in the context of your users being other developers, in my case, other developers inside our company. So there's a couple of different ways that you can build products for other developers. There's APIs, there's frameworks, there's plugins and libraries, and there's component libraries. So component libraries is what I'm going to be talking about today. As a front-end developer, that's the one that I know anything about. But there, and most people in the development side of things will be familiar with APIs as a way to send your data to other users and things like that. And a lot of these things have similar concerns in a way, in terms of thinking about the same things, of making sure your users understand how to do things, how to work with what you've built, things like that. And yeah, the other question when you're building for other developers is like, who are you building for? Are you building for something internal where the people that are using it are people that are sitting next to you, that are in the same office or another office of the same company that you can easily chat to day to day? Is it a client where you're maybe going to build something and then you have to hand it off at the end of the day? It's done, you hand it off, you go somewhere else. Is it for customers? So is it something where you build it and you keep it running, but you charge for access or things like that, where you maybe then have to think about things like, okay, they have certain expectations of uptime, certain promises, things like that. Or are you building it for the general public? If you're building something like an Angular or React framework or any sort of front-end or back-end library that people are going to use and just take off the internet at any time and expect it to work. These are all things that you have to consider. So yeah, component libraries is what I'm going to talk about, very much front-end focused. Hopefully, as I've not had it too technical, so hopefully it still makes sense to the many people that I think have a fear of front-end, which seems to be a thing. So hopefully it's not too terrifying. So yeah, we're going to talk about building a library. So there's reasons why you want to build a library as opposed to just building a bunch of individual bits for people to use. The first reason is that you want it to be cohesive. You want it all to make sense together. Like, these are things that, as I say, they work on side by side. They have to sit on the same page or in the same application. So you don't want things where in this one the font's pure black, and this one the font's navy, and this one the icons are bigger, and then this one the icons are smaller, because it's just not a nice experience for your end users or anyone else. It's confusing, it looks broken. People don't trust the data and the functions of your app if it doesn't look right, because they just think, well, if you don't know what you're doing there, you probably don't know what you're doing anywhere else either. It also needs to be consistent, because it just makes it easier for the end users. They need to be able to jump from one page to another and know, well, this is how I did it in this other part of the application, so now I know when I jump into this other page that it works the same way. If this is how I export data from a table over here, then I know how to export data from this other table, because it works the same way. And brand identity, this is the corporate side of it, but most companies, if they're building software, they want it to look like it's from their brand, right? Because they want people to trust that brand. They want people to use it and say, oh yeah, I want to buy more software from that company because I know how it works, I know how it looks, I know how it feels, it's trustworthy, it's comfortable to use, things like that. So yeah, what are components? Components in this context are front-end components are basically the building blocks. It's the smallest little pieces of your application that you can break something down into. So that might be a text box or a button or a tooltip or an icon, anything like that, a menu, just the things that people use to like build up the whole application altogether. You want it to be the smallest possible thing, because the bigger you get complexity, the harder it is for it to make sense and the harder it is for your developer users to use. You want it to be reusable, because if you're building components that can only be used once, it's just not really a good use of time. Like, the whole benefit of a component library is there's things that can be used multiple times over in multiple places. If it's something that only needs used once, it's probably best being built in the specific application that needs it, so you can make it work exactly the way you want it to work that one time. And it needs to be customizable, so I'll kind of talk about this in the example later on, but essentially the thing is, like, even though you're passing in, you're building components, people need to be able to do certain things with them. Like, if I have a button on one page that says next and a button on another page that says submit, so I need to be able to say, okay, yeah, I need to pass it whatever text I want it to be. I need to say whether it's like a call to action button versus like a small info button versus a download button. You know, we need to be able to say, I want to use the same component, but I want to customize it based on where I'm using it in the app that I'm building. So design. How do you design these components? How do you figure out what should be built? The first thing to think of is, what's the task to be completed? What am I trying to solve? What am I trying to do with this? Is the question, somebody needs to input a piece, like a name, or somebody needs to input a note? Okay, well then we need a text input. Is it somebody needs to download? Okay, so we need a download button that works a certain way, has a certain type of icon, things like that. And then you think, well, does anything already do this? Like, have we already built a component that does this and we could just customize it? We could just sort of add a variation to what we already have rather than building something new, because then it'll be something our developers already know how to work with. And what are our user expectations? Like, what do they need? If we're building something for developers to put in their app, we need to know what their apps do and how their apps work. And also things like, what language are they using? What frameworks are they using? Because if everyone in my company is building in React and I build in a different framework, I build an Angular button, that's absolutely no use to them. I've just wasted my time, essentially. It will look really nice, but they'll never use it, so that's fine. So yeah, you need to know like what they want, what they need to do with it, and when we talk about that customizability, like, what do they want to be able to customize? And on the other side of that, what do we not want them to be able to customize? When we talked about the brand identity, a lot of the times the company will say, well, these are, for example, our brand colors. A developer can pick up this button or this icon to use one of those brand colors, but they can't put in neon green if our company is all blues. They can't have like, well, this is our neon green and neon orange section of the app. Like, we probably don't want them to do that. I would, but we probably don't want them. And on that, it needs to fit in with where it's used. So it needs to have a similar style. It needs to look, like we talked about earlier, like that it belongs in that app. If I have, a whole app that looks very sort of corporate and it's very polished and it's for like a really particular setting where people are using it in an office, I probably don't want to start putting like headings that use Comic Sans and cartoon thought bubbles and things like that. Like, it just wouldn't belong and it won't feel like it's part of the same set. This is a lot easier whenever you're building for like internal or for a client, because you probably have a brief and a theme and a particular look and feel. It can be harder when you're doing things for like the general public, because that's like a million people and they all want a really specific thing that they think you can build for them that's absolutely nothing like what anyone else wants. So that gets a lot harder and you can get a lot bigger scope then, and you kind of have to force yourself to make some decisions on where do we draw the line of what we support and what we don't. You want to solve a problem just once, like we talked about. Like, if you have a button, I don't want to have to make 30 different buttons. That's going against the whole benefit of the component library. I want to make a button that I can customize to be able to do the kind of different things I need. And it needs to be flexible for those variations. I need to be able to say, okay, I can pass it text, or I can pass it an icon, or I can have a button that opens a menu versus a button that just submits a form, things like that. So now that we've sort of thought about our component and what we need to think about, it's time to think, like, what will people be doing with this component? Like, how will those developers be using it? So we want to decide some things like, what do we keep internal to the component versus what do we expose to the other developers? There will be certain things, like the way that component works, that we maybe say, well, these are things that have to be consistent, where it absolutely has to do this particular behavior everywhere that it's used. So we don't want to expose that to the other developers, because then they can change it and they sort of lose that benefit of that consistency and that familiarity for their end user. On the other hand, we do want to expose things like we talked about, where they need to press a button, or we need to say, you can pass in the function that you want this button to call, or you can pass in the data that you want this download button to download. You know, those are the things that they need to be able to change, whereas there'll be other things where it's like, if they change this, they might as well have just used their own component from the start. And yeah, how customizable should it be? Should they be allowed to say only brand colors? You know, it sort of depends on where it's being used. Like in our company, we have multiple different pieces of software, and different software pieces have different color schemes. We have a set of color tokens, and it's like, these are the ones you can choose from. Whereas other people might say, oh, you know, you can use anything, you just have to get it approved by your designer or whatever. We have a strict set of colors that they can use. Localization and accessibility, so they're both giant topics that I could give an entire talk on. I won't. Maybe next time. Localization is, for those that aren't familiar, making your app work in multiple locales and with multiple languages. So if you are saying, okay, say I'm launching an app in Canada, I need to support French and English because those are both primary languages in that country and parts of that country. So, for example, I don't want any components where the text is hard-coded in. The users need to be able to, like the developer users need to be able to pass in the translated versions of all of the text. If I have something that I hard-code into the component, then they can't translate it into French or German or whatever other language they need to support. Accessibility is similar. If I have a component that displays an image, I need to require that those users also pass me the alt text for those images, which is how screen reader users will be able to use it. This one falls into both like what to expose and what not to expose. One of the benefits of a component library is that you can force some accessibility and have it in there from the start so your users have less to do. But there are certain things where you know that you need to make sure they pass that in to keep the app accessible. And as I mentioned, framework compatibility. So if all of my users use Angular, I want to use Angular. If all my users build in React, I want to build in React. If they're all using multiple, you can either build your library for multiple things, or you can just say, get back to me when you've changed your framework, good luck, which is sometimes what we have to do. It really depends on your resources and how many people are building your component library as to whether you can justify building for multiple frameworks or not. So this is an example. This is a component sort of based on a component that I've been working on recently in work. So it's a toast, what we call a toast notification, which is just like an in-page notification. It pops up when something happens, like say you save data from a form. It will pop up, give you, you know, it saved, it didn't save, there was a problem, everything was fine, things like that. Or if somebody else did something elsewhere and you need to be notified of it, you'll get that notification. So you can sort of see that there are 4 variations on this, but they all look pretty similar. So the things that are similar that we don't want the developers to be able to change are things like the sizing, the background color, where the close button is, where the icon is. Because if those things were changed, it would start to be really confusing for our end users. If sometimes they get a notification and the icon's on the right and the close button was on the bottom left, it would be really confusing, it'd be really difficult to use. And things like, so with this one that we made, it doesn't dismiss because for accessibility reasons, you want that to stay there until the user closes it so they can choose how long it takes them to read it. The worst thing is a notification that disappears before you read it, or if you're like me, you somehow swipe away a notification halfway through the fact that you're reading it. I don't know how I do it, but I do. So you want that consistency. You know, if you open your phone, all your notifications on your lock screen look the same. You know how to swipe it. It's not like, oh, if it's a Facebook notification, you swipe right to close, and if it's Instagram, you swipe left to close. That would be really confusing. But the things that we do want to let them control are things like, what kind of notification is it? Is it informational? Is it success? Is it a warning? Is it an error? What's the text in it? You know, what do we actually need to tell them? That's going to be different every single time, so there's no point building that in. We need to let them tell us. And with the close text, you know, that's one thing where, like I mentioned, although the button will always close, we need to let them pass in text so that they can pass in translated text. So that, you know, they can pass in French, German, English, whatever. If they need to do languages that aren't left to right, then we haven't done support for that yet, but we will. Then that's a whole other thing, but you have to kind of keep all these things in mind and consider how your layout will work. And that's one of the things with building a component, is you can see the top notification has a lot more text than the others. So you have to make sure that as much as possible you can facilitate the user doing whatever they need to do. You don't want to get in their way. You don't want to block them being able to put the information that they need to put in. And you need to make sure that the component still works and still has that consistency and that familiarity. So I don't know how easy this is to read and how terrifying it is for those people I mentioned that are terrified of front end. It's just a bit of HTML. So what it does is the buttons are just sending the functionality that will call a toast message. So the way this thing works is that the bottom line is essentially a giant invisible container that sits over your entire application. And that's where you tell it, where should all my notifications appear on the page? Because based on your app and how it works, you might say, okay, well, bottom right is where our unused space is, or bottom left, is it on a tablet, is it on a desktop? Where does that make sense? That's something we want them to be able to customize. And then you can see there's a closed text as well, because although we want them to be able to customize it, we don't want them to be able to customize it per notification, because they're unlikely to have it be different every time, and we don't really want them to, because that would just be really confusing and strange. So we just say, for all notifications, what should it look like for the close button? And then they can say, pass in the type, whether it's information or success, pass in the text. And then we pass in an ID as well. And the reason that we do that is for testing. So with component libraries, because your apps are going into other applications, you want your developers to be able to pass in really specific IDs so that whenever the tests are written, they can pull out those specific components. We've had a lot of problems in the past where we have components that don't have any IDs, and it can be really painful for the testers to try to get to them and make sure that they work all right. So the test is just or the ID is just a unique identifier for that exact component in your page, so that your testers can get to it. Talked really into the mic there, accidentally. So the next big thing, which I think a lot of people see the word documentation and they're like, no, don't make me. You have to document component libraries, because you're building it for other people. Like, you're not just building it for yourself. So it doesn't matter how well you know it. Like, you're not the end user. You're not the person that's looking at the code every day. There's loads of tools that do this, loads of places to put it. You could put it in Confluence if you really want to. I mean, it's awful, but you could. There's things like Storybook that are built specifically for this, where they let you interact with the components and they let the developers interact with the components, so they can make sure that it's the component they want to use and that they understand how it works, and they can play around with it, they can test it out, things like that. So yeah, where does your documentation live? If it's internal to your company, then it can be anywhere internal. If you're building something that's for other people, then it becomes more of a question, is it password protected? Is it public? Is it something where you have to hand it off to your client and let them decide where they're putting it? Things like that. What do you cover in your documentation? The main thing obviously is how to use the components, but you need to cover things like, well, these are the things you can customize. These are the things you can't customize. This is what it will look like if it doesn't work. These are maybe some dependencies, like, for you to be able to use this toast notification, maybe you need to be on a certain version of the component library, things like that. And then the biggest one is how to install the component library. So you can either have it where people install every single component as they need it, or maybe they just install the whole library and then they pick and choose what they want. But either way, you just have to document that, because people just won't know. There's not one, the only way to possibly do it. So you have to make sure you say that. How do you showcase components? So I mentioned that Storybook before is one of the examples, or you can build your own, or you can use other tools. But you really want a way to show what those components look like for numerous reasons, partly to help your developers make sure they're using the right component, partly for your designers so they can see what they're working with. So they can go, okay, well, I wanted to do this functionality and I can see these are the components that we already have. This is maybe faster and easier than me designing something new, and I can make sure that it does what I want. And one big thing with that is that if possible, you want to try and showcase them in the real world scenario. So in a sample version of one of your apps or something like that, so people can see how it works with the layouts and things like that. If you have a consistent, say you have a consistent header and footer, you want to show that those things display right and that they don't clash, they don't, break because they're in a certain place. And then, versioning and upgrades. This is probably the most painful one, because once people start using your component library, they never want to update the version they have. ever, because they're like, no, but this one works, and if I update it, it won't work. And then you're like, but this one has new stuff, and it's nicer, and it'll work better. So yeah, it depends really in your company whether you want to go down the like, you stop supporting old versions after a certain amount of time, or you just resign yourself to supporting every version forever. But you need to find a way to document that and communicate that out to people. And especially if some of your components are only available in certain versions, then you need to document that on each component. Like, you have to be on this version to be able to get this component. Yeah, so just things to consider in general when you're making components. You want to avoid people having to hack things, which what I mean is, like, if you build a component that's like almost but not quite what they need, then there's a chance they're going to start hacking it and trying to force it to do things that it doesn't do. So you need to constantly be aware of what those developers making apps need to do, and what they need to work with, what options they need to have. So if you don't provide those, if you're not listening, they're just going to start forcing your components to do things, and then they'll break, and then they'll tell you your component doesn't work, and you'll be like, but it's because you didn't use it right. You also, you make sure the devs know what components to use for what things. So if I have a text area and a text input, and I realize if you're not front end, you're like, those are the same thing. But they're not. Technically, a text input is like one line, and a text area is like a big area where you can put lines and lines and lines of notes, and there's like not really any rules on it. So you want to make sure, like, oh, if they're writing a form where they need to have like error messages and validation and like set lengths and things like that, that they use the right component, the one that will let them do that, rather than using the wrong component and then getting frustrated or not understanding why it doesn't let them do the things they want to do. You need to consider having multiple components on one page. Sorry, I could see the 5-minute page being moved and I'm terrified. It's fine, totally fine. You need to make sure you have multiple components on one page, and I call this out specifically because this is a mistake that was made by a team I was on when we made a component library in the past, where we had a bunch of styles, and they were fine whenever we were in our showcase and you were only looking at one component at a time. But then whenever we went into the app, there was like a clash where some of the things used the same names, and therefore the styles were being applied in the wrong places, if they were being applied to multiple components instead of one, things like that. So you need to just make sure that's something that you test, make sure that's something that you work with, and that things don't clash with each other in terms of your JavaScript, your CSS, anything like that. And yeah, the painful one can be event triggering, data handling, things like that. You're making a component and it doesn't, like, you're not building it in the context of the app, so you don't know what that data looks like, you don't know how those events are going to work. So that's the biggest area where you need to be flexible, and you need to be like, try not to be too prescriptive. You want to be prescriptive enough to make sure that it works, but you don't want to force your apps to only be able to handle data one particular way, especially if you're in a case like sort of where we are sometimes, where the app already exists and they're trying to upgrade, because it's just going to be a big barrier to upgrading if they have to change absolutely everything to work this one really fine and particular way. It's just going to put them off, rather than if they say, okay, well, we can change the components, but they'll still work behind the scenes the same way. So the end user, which is like, we're building for developers, but it's the end user that needs to worry about it, you know. So the benefits of components for the end user are really that we can sort of force our developers to use best practices as much as possible. If we're using them in the components, then they're kind of built in by default, and it would take like intentional work for your developers to go against those. And you get that accessibility. Accessibility is like a big pet project of mine. I've given talks on it and things. So I like building a component library because I can sort of force everything to be accessible, and developers don't get a choice. I'm just like, it's too late, it's already accessible, just don't break it and we'll be fine. And the same with localization, you know, it means your developers are getting a lot of that work for free, so whenever they're ready to build in those other languages, it's not a big chore for them. And consistency, right, that's the biggest thing of all. It's the biggest reason we build component libraries. It's just to make sure that no matter what page I'm on, it's using the same components, means it feels the same, it works the same. It's not going to have where, you know, the same thing on 2 different pages works totally differently, because that will just turn people away from using your app. And then the final big question is contributions. Do you want to take contributions? Do you want to allow external contributions, or do you want to allow internal contributions where people aren't in your team but they are in your company? And if so, how do you do this? How do you make sure that those contributions are good quality? How do you make sure that they follow the same coding standards and everything else as the rest of your components? Do you want to take feedback if you're not taking contributions? Do you want to just take feedback and handle them that way and promise to, address feedback? How do you handle bugs and updates? Do you let people submit requests or submit code to fix bugs, or do you just have a ticket list where you kind of go and fix those issues? The biggest thing here is communication. In my company, we have a fortnightly meeting from the company, my team that builds the component library, and all the other teams that use it. So we can have that back and forth. We can decide and agree on, okay, these people need this component, and sort of these people, 4 teams need it, we'll build it. 1 team only needs it, they can build it, and they can push it back into the library. And that seems to work pretty well. So, conclusion, I will technically finish on time. Positives are, the big thing is for developers, it's a good way to avoid repeated work. And that's a good thing for the company too, right? You don't have 4 teams all spending 3 weeks doing the exact same thing. If you can have 1 team do that and then the 4 other teams just use it, it frees up a lot of people to do a lot of other things on their own projects. It provides that consistent user experience that we've talked about, and the quality that we've talked about. You can have people dedicated to these components, and then it means sometimes if you have other app teams that maybe don't have people that are focused front-end developers, they don't have to have that same level of experience because they have the components ready and there's less work for them to do to make those work. And it makes everything feel familiar, like we've talked about, for the end user. The negatives are, it can get overly complex. It's easy, and you might have seen it sometimes, to have a component library that has 3,000 components, because you make every single tiny variation of something into a different component. And it's confusing, and there's loads of things that you can't do that you want to do, and you just have to avoid it. People won't use components if they're too restrictive. If they can't do exactly what they want to do, they'll just say, oh, it's not worth it, I'll just make my own component, and then it won't follow those guidelines and that consistency. And the big thing, especially on the design side, is it can be hard to design a component when you don't have insight to the app that's using it. If you don't know what those apps look like, it can be really hard to know how it should feel, how it should work, what the data is going to look like that's going into it. So that's part of why we have those meetings with our teams. Ideally, if you are doing this internally, the best solution is to just have regular communication with the teams that are using your components, so that you know what they're building. You can see the common patterns between, well, this team, like say an ESO, the fire brigade team are maybe making this software, the ambulance team are making this software. If I can see them both, I can spot I can spot the consistencies and the things that will be the same and build for those. Why has this screen gone black? So in conclusion, component libraries are a good tool for developers because they save that time and effort. They can be a good experience for the end user, but just don't over-engineer it. Don't be super restrictive. Don't lock it down so much that it becomes not worth using. That's it. Technically, I finished on time, right? Yes, thank you. Oh my gosh. Okay.